Picture this. It's the dry season, somewhere in ancient East Africa, around 100,000 years ago, and a watering hole that usually presents multiple options for where to drink has contracted to a single muddy, heavily trafficked pool that is, by any objective biological assessment, absolutely disgusting. It's shared by everything in the local area. Elephants have been standing in it, hippos have been doing what hippos do in water, which is everything, continuously enthusiastically with zero regard for anyone's preferences. Various ungulates have been drinking from it while also depositing whatever their digestive systems were processing at the time. The water is warm, brown, and contains a biological community of staggering diversity, most of which would make a modern microbiologist either very excited or very concerned, depending on their specific research interests. Into this watering hole walks a group of ancient humans who are also thirsty and who don't have the option of waiting for a cleaner water source because there isn't one within any distance that makes sense given their current hydration status. They drink. Most of them will be fine. Some will experience digestive discomfort. Occasionally, one will become seriously ill, but the group as a whole will survive and move on, which means either they were lucky or something more systematic was protecting them from the full consequences of drinking what was, by modern standards, a microbial soup of considerable potency. That question, how ancient humans and the animals around them managed to drink water that would hospitalize most modern people, is what this video is actually investigating. Stick around because the answer crosses animal physiology, ancient human behavioral ecology, accumulated knowledge systems, and some surprisingly specific biological mechanisms that explain a lot about why the animal kingdom isn't in a constant state of waterborne disease collapse despite lacking any access to water treatment facilities. A luxury that, if you told an ancient human about it, they would probably consider some kind of elaborate joke. Start with the animal side of this because the mechanisms are clearer there and provide the biological baseline against which ancient human adaptations make more sense. Wild animals drinking from shared contaminated water sources are not simply getting lucky. They're protected by a combination of biological adaptations that range from basic immune function to highly specific physiological features developed through millions of years of exposure to exactly the kind of water environments their ecosystems provide. The stomach acid situation is fundamental and underappreciated. Most mammalian stomach acid is considerably more concentrated and more biologically hostile than human stomach acid, operating at pH levels low enough to kill a substantial proportion of microbial contaminants before they can reach the intestinal tract where most waterborne infections actually cause damage. The relatively lower stomach acid concentration in humans compared to many wild mammals reflects our evolutionary history as fire-using, food-processing omnivores for whom cooking and food preparation provided pathogen reduction that reduced the selective pressure for extreme stomach acid acidity. Wild animals that drink raw, unprocessed water from shared sources benefit from stomach environments that are frankly hostile to a wider range of potential pathogens than the human stomach provides. Here's a fun detail that nobody asked for but absolutely deserves inclusion. Human stomach acid, while not the most impressive in the animal kingdom, is still strong enough to dissolve a razor blade given sufficient time. It's just that a razor blade doesn't reproduce, spread through populations, and cause cholera, which is unfortunately the more relevant comparison in this specific discussion. Gut microbiome composition is another layer of protection that wild animals maintain through their continuous exposure to environmental microbiota. A wild animal drinking from a shared watering hole is not encountering microbial communities its gut is naive to. It has been continuously exposed to the microorganisms characteristic of its environment throughout its entire life, building an established gut microbiome that includes organisms capable of outcompeting and suppressing many potential pathogens. The ecological concept of competitive exclusion applies inside the gut as much as in external ecosystems. An established, diverse microbial community provides inherent resistance to colonization by newcomers, including pathogenic ones, because the available niches are already occupied by existing residents. This is one reason that isolated modern humans encountering water sources in unfamiliar disease environments often fare worse than the local wildlife, not because their immune systems are inherently weaker, but because they haven't had the continuous lifelong exposure to local microbiota that builds the specific gut microbiome composition providing local pathogen resistance. Ancient human groups that spent their entire lives in a specific territory would have had gut microbiomes extensively shaped by that territory's specific microbial community, providing a form of local pathogen resistance that the modern traveler from a different environment spectacularly lacks, as any tourist who has confidently ordered the local salad in the wrong country can personally attest. Immune system calibration through continuous low level exposure is the mechanism underlying this gut microbiome effect, and it operates more broadly across the immune system beyond just gut ecology. Wild animals experiencing continuous exposure to environmental pathogens throughout their lives maintain immune systems that are continuously calibrated against the specific pathogens of their environment, with antibody profiles and immune memory shaped by the actual threat landscape rather than theoretical ones. This continuous calibration produces immune systems that are responsive and experienced rather than naive, with established memory responses to pathogens they've encountered repeatedly that allow faster and more effective clearance on subsequent exposures. Ancient humans benefited from the same continuous calibration process. An ancient human who had been drinking from the same seasonal waterholes in the same territory throughout their life had an immune system shaped by repeated exposure to the specific microbial community those waterholes contained, with established memory responses to the pathogens present there. This explains why ancient humans could drink from water sources that would be immediately dangerous to modern people who had grown up in environments with treated water and very different microbial exposure histories. The immune difference is experiential rather than fundamental, which is a polite way of saying that modern sanitized living has made many of us dramatically more delicate than our ancient ancestors, while simultaneously extending our lifespans considerably. Which is a trade-off that seems reasonable in the abstract but feels personally insulting the moment you get sick from drinking tap water abroad. The behavioral ecology dimension of how animals manage water quality is sophisticated and worth examining specifically, because many animals actively practice water source selection behaviors that reduce their pathogen exposure without any understanding of why those behaviors are protective. Animals tend to preferentially approach water from upstream rather than downstream at shared water holes, which reduces exposure to material deposited by other animals drinking and standing in the water. Many animals demonstrate drinking timing preferences that separate them from the peak periods of use by other species, reducing the concentration of fresh biological material in the water during their access period. Various prey species prefer to drink from moving water rather than still water when available, a preference that likely reflects empirical association between still water and illness outcomes without any understanding of why still water carries higher pathogen loads. Still water provides better conditions for pathogen multiplication than flowing water, and an animal that has learned or inherited a preference for moving water sources is inadvertently avoiding higher pathogen concentrations without any conceptual understanding of microbiology. The adaptive outcome is the same regardless of whether the underlying mechanism is understood. What makes this genuinely funny in a cosmic sense is that these animals have been practicing better water safety hygiene than many human civilizations managed for most of recorded history, entirely through behavioral intuition rather than any formal understanding, which says something interesting about how knowledge works in biological systems and also something slightly embarrassing about human civilization's water management track record for most of its existence. Ancient humans brought all of these basic animal approaches to water management plus something no other species possessed: accumulated, culturally transmitted behavioral knowledge about water quality and water safety that went considerably beyond what individual experience or instinct could produce. We've discussed throughout this series how ancient human oral culture functioned as a multi-generational knowledge transmission system, with practical observations encoded in stories, taboos, and behavioral rules that preserved accurate information without requiring anyone to understand the mechanisms behind it. Water safety knowledge was almost certainly a significant component of this accumulated transmitted wisdom. Knowledge about which water sources in a territory were reliably safe versus which ones produced illness, which seasons made specific sources more or less safe, what visible or olfactory characteristics were associated with water that caused problems, how long after heavy animal activity a source should be avoided before drinking safely. All of this practical water safety intelligence would have been accumulated across generations of observation in any specific territory and transmitted as part of the practical ecological knowledge that determined where ancient human groups chose to camp, when they chose to travel between water sources and how they managed water access in different seasonal conditions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. There is something beautifully ironic about the fact that ancient humans figured out reasonable water safety protocols thousands of years before germ theory existed, encoding effective behavioral rules through observed outcomes rather than mechanistic understanding. An ancient elder explaining to a younger group member that the particular pool near the dead tree always made people sick and should be avoided was, functionally, doing epidemiology without the word for it, which is either inspiring or deeply humbling depending on how proud you feel about modern science. The ability to observe patterns between water source characteristics and health outcomes and transmit those observations culturally is specifically a human capability. A lion that gets sick after drinking from a specific source might individually learn to avoid that source, but it cannot communicate that learned association to other lions who haven't had the same experience in a way that would persist across multiple generations. Ancient humans could do exactly this, encoding water safety observations in transmitted knowledge that allowed group members who had never personally experienced the illness associated with a specific source to nevertheless avoid it based on transmitted warning. Water vessel technology, which ancient humans developed as part of their broader material culture, added another dimension to water management that no other species possessed. Carrying water in containers, documented through preserved vessels and the circumstantial evidence of ancient human mobility patterns in arid regions, allowed ancient humans to access and transport water from sources they had identified as reliable, reducing dependence on whatever water was immediately available at any given location. The strategic management of water access through stored and transported water provided options for quality control that purely on-demand drinking from available sources couldn't offer. The sheer audacity of the concept of carrying water around in a container is actually remarkable when you consider that no other species had figured this out. Every other animal on the planet operates on the principle that when you're thirsty, you go find water. Ancient humans looked at this arrangement and essentially said, what if we just brought the water with us? This is the kind of thinking that eventually produces civilization, indoor plumbing, and ultimately the plastic water bottle industry, which suggests that some chains of consequences are longer and stranger than anyone initially anticipates. Boiling water, which would have been available to ancient humans whenever fire was maintained, represents an obvious but important point in this conversation. We've established in our fire video that ancient humans had reliable fire access deep into the ancient era. The application of that fire to water heating, whether the specific connection between heated water and reduced illness was explicitly understood or simply empirically associated over time, would have provided significant pathogen reduction that animals without fire access couldn't achieve. The question of whether ancient humans specifically boiled water for purification purposes, or whether water heating was incidental to food preparation is unknown for the deep ancient period, but the capability was present, and the associations between outcomes were the kind of observable patterns that ancient oral knowledge systems captured. Hippopotamuses deserve specific treatment in any discussion of animal water management because they represent the most extreme case of apparently thriving, despite water conditions that would seem hostile to survival. Hippos spend most of their time in water, that is, largely because of hippoactivity, extraordinarily high in organic material and biological content. A single hippo deposits an estimated several kilograms of dung per day, and hippopods often number in the dozens or hundreds, which means the water. A hippo is serenely floating in at any given moment contains a quantity of biological material that is best not calculated if you want to maintain any positive feelings about rivers. And yet hippos are fine. They are, in fact, extremely healthy animals that live for decades and demonstrate no apparent discomfort about their water quality situation whatsoever. They're protected by several specific adaptations, including a skin secretion that functions as both sunscreen and antimicrobial agent, reducing the pathogen load on their skin surface during extended water immersion, and digestive systems specifically adapted to handle the microbial environment they continuously inhabit. The hippo is essentially adapted to its own highly contaminated water environment in ways that reflect millions of years of coevolution with that specific ecological situation. The hippo has essentially turned being disgusting into a survival strategy, which is admirable in its own specific way. Crocodilians present another fascinating case because they live in water environments and consume prey whole, including the intestinal contents of whatever they eat, representing continuous exposure to enormous microbial diversity that should, by any intuitive assessment, produce constant illness. Crocodilian immune systems are consequently among the most sophisticated and broadly effective in the vertebrate world, with immune factors in crocodilian blood showing documented activity against a remarkable range of pathogens, including some antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains. Research on crocodilian immunity has attracted scientific interest precisely because of how effective it is, representing millions of years of immune system evolution under conditions of very high and diverse pathogen exposure. The crocodile has essentially solved the pathogen problem by having an immune system so aggressive that it functions as a biological sterilization chamber. Every infection a crocodile encounters is a research opportunity, which is why researchers studying antibiotic resistance have actually looked to crocodilian blood as a potential source of new antimicrobial compounds. The crocodile, in other words, might eventually help save human lives through medical research, which is a deeply unexpected twist in the long history of the crocodile-human relationship, which had previously been characterized primarily by the crocodile trying to eat ancient humans at waterhole margins. Vultures and other scavenging species represent the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of consuming material with very high pathogen loads, and their survival is explicable through a combination of extremely concentrated stomach acid that kills most bacteria on contact, immune systems calibrated to the specific microbial communities associated with decomposing tissue, and microbiomes containing organisms specifically adapted to the scavenging diet that provide competitive exclusion against standard pathogens. The vulture's ability to consume material that would be instantly dangerous to most mammals reflects millions of years of specialized adaptation to exactly that dietary niche. What's particularly striking about vultures is that their digestive systems are so thoroughly hostile to pathogens that they can consume anthrax-infected carcasses and emerge entirely unaffected, which is the kind of sentence that takes a moment to fully process. Anthrax, which has been weaponized and used in bioterrorism contexts, is simply not a significant concern for an animal that has spent millions of years adapting to consume things that would kill everything else at the table. The vulture's existence is essentially a constant refutation of the idea that you are what you eat, since the vulture eats catastrophically awful things and is absolutely fine. Returning to ancient humans specifically, the combination of continuous environmental exposure, calibrating both immune systems and gut microbiomes, accumulated cultural knowledge about water source quality and timing, behavioral flexibility to seek better sources when available, early water storage and transport technology reducing dependence on whatever was immediately at hand, and access to fire for water heating when circumstances permitted created a water management capability that significantly exceeded what pure physiology alone would have provided. And that explains how ancient humans managed water quality in ways that allowed population growth and territorial expansion across diverse environments. The comparative vulnerability of ancient humans to waterborne illness compared to wild animals reflects a real biological reality. We don't have the specific gastric acid levels of a lion or the specialized immune factors of a crocodile. We are not as robustly adapted to drinking from shared, heavily used water sources as animals that have spent millions of years doing exactly that without the option of behavioral or technological alternatives. The human biological package is oriented toward an omnivorous, highly mobile, socially sophisticated lifestyle where behavioral flexibility and cultural knowledge supplement more modest physiological defenses rather than replacing them entirely. This orientation toward supplementing physiology with behavior and knowledge rather than developing extreme physiological defenses is characteristic of the broader human adaptive strategy we've documented throughout this series. Humans are not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most physiologically specialized for any single ecological challenge. We are the most behaviorally flexible, the most knowledge accumulating, and the most capable of developing and transmitting specific solutions to specific problems. Water management in the ancient world reflects exactly this pattern. Adequate but not extreme physiological defenses supplemented by behavioral management, accumulated environmental knowledge, and eventually technological intervention that together produced adequate outcomes in environments where the available water was far from what modern sanitation would consider acceptable. Something that rarely gets mentioned in discussions of ancient water management is the specific role that children played in the accidental testing of different water sources. Ancient children, as we've documented in our Ancient Children video, were exposed to environmental hazards as a matter of course in ways that modern children are extensively protected from. A child drinking from a water source that an adult had identified as questionable and suffering the consequences was, functionally, providing data that updated the group's assessment of that source. This is an extremely grim form of empirical research, but it was operating whether anyone recognized it as such or not, and the outcomes fed back into the accumulated knowledge base about which sources were safer and which weren't. The specific costs that ancient humans did bear from waterborne illness deserve honest acknowledgement. Waterborne pathogens, including various bacterial, parasitic, and potentially viral agents, almost certainly represented a significant source of illness and mortality throughout the ancient human era, particularly for children whose immune systems were still developing and hadn't yet accumulated the calibrated response profile that adults maintained. We discussed in our Ancient Children video how high childhood mortality was throughout the ancient era, and waterborne illness would have been a contributing factor in that mortality alongside other causes. The communities that managed water quality better through better site selection, better behavioral protocols, or better transmitted knowledge about local water sources would have experienced lower waterborne illness burden, which translates directly to higher child survival rates, better overall group health, and consequently more successful foraging and hunting activity. Water management capability was, in this direct sense, a survival-relevant dimension of ancient human knowledge that contributed to differential success between groups with better and worse water management practices. The picture that emerges from this examination is of ancient humans occupying a middle position in the water quality management spectrum. Less physiologically robust than the extreme specialists like crocodiles and vultures, but more behaviorally and culturally capable of managing water quality risks than any non-human species. That middle position was adequate for survival and population growth across the entire deep ancient era, which is ultimately what matters for evaluating the strategy's success. Ancient humans drank from some deeply questionable water sources and mostly survived, not by luck and not through extreme physiological adaptation, but through the combination of reasonable baseline immune function, continuous environmental calibration, accumulated behavioral knowledge, and developing technological capability that characterizes the specifically human approach to every survival challenge the ancient world presented. The watering hole in ancient East Africa from our opening scenario was a public health crisis waiting to happen by modern standards and a functional daily necessity by ancient standards. The ancient humans who drank from it walked away because everything we've covered here was working for them. Not perfectly, not without cost, but adequately for what the ancient world required. And adequately for what the ancient world required is, as this series has demonstrated again and again, exactly what ancient humans consistently managed to achieve through means that impress considerably more the more carefully you examine them. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all this, which is that the ancient human approach to dirty water, observing outcomes, accumulating knowledge, sharing information, developing behavioral protocols based on pattern recognition rather than mechanistic understanding, is actually the same basic approach that produced modern water treatment science. The path from an ancient elder warning group members away from the pool near the dead tree because it always made people sick to the development of municipal water. Filtration is longer and more technically complex than any single video can convey, but it's a single continuous thread of exactly the same basic human impulse, noticing that some water makes people sick and doing something about it.